When I saw my husband open the guest room door and glance around with that tired, distracted look he always had after a long day, I didn't think much of it. But then I noticed his eyes narrowing. Something about the way he paused, squinted, then stepped in, as if following a scent or a memory, made my stomach twist. I was frozen in the hallway, heart thudding in my chest, while he looked down at the half-empty glass of wine on the table, the faint indent on the couch cushion, the crumpled napkin. None of it was damning on its own. But together, they told a story. A story I prayed he wouldn't be able to read. He didn't call out my name. He didn't ask questions. He just stood there, staring, piecing together what didn't fit. I felt my mouth go dry. My legs wouldn't move. He turned around slowly, and I could see the moment it happened, the moment he saw it in my eyes. That I had something to hide. Something I couldn't erase. My throat tightened as I stepped forward, wanting to say something, anything, but no words came. I watched him walk past me, silent, stiff. I wanted to reach for his hand, stop him, beg him not to ask. Not yet. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One that unfolded quietly, beneath layers of routine and politeness, one that changed everything I thought I was. And now, standing on the edge of a truth I wasn't ready to share, I realized there was no turning back. But before I tell you how it all unraveled, how a dinner became the beginning of the end, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching this from, and answer honestly, have you ever kept a secret so heavy, it threatened to pull your entire life apart? The first time I stepped into his family's house, I felt like an outsider wrapped in politeness. The kind of politeness that wasn't meant to include me but rather to tolerate me. I stood there, my hands slightly damp, adjusting the sleeves of my blouse while the smell of roasted vegetables and warm bread hung in the air. Everything was too familiar, the framed pictures lining the hallway, the laughter from the kitchen, the way people moved around each other effortlessly, as if part of a long-rehearsed dance. I wasn't part of that choreography. I was an addition. A guest. I had heard so much about his mother, his sister, the infamous cousin who always brought the wrong kind of wine, the aunt who commented on weight, the father who barely spoke. But hearing stories and being there, in the middle of it, were two entirely different things. I walked into the kitchen with a practiced smile, offered my help with setting the table, only to be gently waved away with a "You're our guest, dear, just relax." Relax. That word always made me feel like I was failing at something. My husband, always so at ease in this house, was already deep in conversation with his sister. They laughed about something that happened years ago, something I couldn't possibly be a part of. He didn't introduce me. He assumed I'd float along, insert myself seamlessly. But I never learned how to do that. Not here. Not with these people. Dinner started with too many forks and too little eye contact. Questions came my way like darts. Where did we meet? How long had we been together? What did I do for work? Did I plan on having children? I answered them with grace, but each response felt like I was defending my presence rather than sharing it. And then came the comments. Subtle, sharp. About how I seemed more quiet than his previous partner. About how his last girlfriend loved baking. About how she used to help clean up without being asked. I laughed. Politely. Nodded. Said how nice. I kept my voice even, my smile warm. But something inside me began to bend. And then, from across the table, a voice cut through the noise. His best friend, the one I'd only met once before, made a joke that diffused the tension. Not about me, but around me. He redirected the attention, shifted the conversation, and in doing so, gave me a moment to breathe. I looked at him, and he smiled. Not with teeth, but with eyes that said, "I see you." After dinner, I offered again to help clean. This time, no one stopped me. I found myself in the kitchen with him, just the two of us, rinsing dishes in silence. He passed me a glass, and our fingers brushed. It was nothing. Just a touch. But I felt it. My body felt it before my mind could explain it away. He asked me how I was holding up. Not in a shallow, social way, but with actual interest. The kind of question that invited honesty. I told him I was fine, of course. I always say I'm fine. He didn't press. Later, as the family moved into the living room for tea, I stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was a balm. I leaned on the railing, letting the chill sink into my skin. I heard footsteps behind me and knew it was him before I turned around. He stood beside me, not too close. Just enough to make his presence felt. We talked about small things, the view, the trees, how the stars looked clearer out here. I said I sometimes missed silence like this. He nodded, understanding in a way that felt unfair. I hated how easy it was to talk to him. Back inside, I watched my husband pour wine for his mother, then lean back with a familiar comfort I never quite reached with him. I remembered our last anniversary, how he forgot the reservation and brought home a grocery store cake instead. I told myself it didn't matter. But I remembered. When bedtime came, they gave us the guest room at the end of the hall. It was small but cozy. I changed in silence, listening to my husband brushing his teeth, scrolling through work emails, answering a call. Even here, even now, he was half elsewhere. I crawled into bed and turned off the light. Sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the early morning, I woke to the creak of the floorboards. I walked to the hallway, needing water. The kitchen was empty, dark. I stood there, unsure, before I saw him, the friend, sitting outside on the porch, cigarette in hand. He looked up, surprised but calm. He offered me a seat. I sat. We didn't say much. The night said enough. He asked if I was okay. Again, I said yes. Again, I wasn't. When I went back to bed, my husband was snoring softly. I laid beside him, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep pretending this life fit me. Wondering why I felt more seen by a man who wasn't mine. And that was the beginning of something I didn't yet understand. The morning light filtering through the curtains didn't soften the weight in my chest. It just made everything more visible, the untouched side of the bed, the crumpled shirt my husband had tossed onto the chair, the faint outline of our luggage against the corner. I sat on the edge of the mattress, motionless, hands folded in my lap like I was waiting for instructions. But there was no one to give them. Just the quiet hum of the old radiator and the occasional clink of dishes from the kitchen downstairs. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the heavy, rushed kind that always meant something urgent. He knocked once before pushing the door open, his phone pressed to his ear, already mid-sentence with someone else. His voice was sharp, hurried, filled with the kind of tension I recognized from years of knowing him. Something had happened, an emergency at the hospital. A colleague sick. A patient critical. He mouthed an apology and began gathering his things. I wanted to say something. To ask him not to go, just this once. But I didn't. I just watched as he pulled on his jacket, checked his pockets for his keys, and pressed a quick kiss to the top of my head without really looking at me. Then the door closed behind him, and I was alone again. Downstairs, the remnants of breakfast lingered, crumbs, half-empty mugs, a plate of sliced fruit untouched. His mother had gone out with one of the cousins. His sister was somewhere in the garden. I moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to disturb anything, yet constantly aware of how out of place I felt in every corner. It wasn't my home. Not really. He was in the living room. The friend. Sitting on the floor, legs stretched out, back leaning against the couch, flipping through an old photo album he must have found on the lower shelf. I paused in the doorway, unsure whether to enter, but he looked up and gave me a look that felt more like a question than a greeting. I stepped in. He didn't say anything right away. Just turned the album so I could see a picture. My husband is a teenager, wild hair and a crooked smile, standing in front of a bicycle. I smiled politely. It felt like the kind of moment that didn't belong to me. But then he asked how I was. Not in that casual, throwaway tone. He asked it like he meant it. I gave my usual answer, I'm fine. But he didn't nod and move on. He waited, letting the silence stretch. And in that space, something in me gave way. I told him I didn't sleep well. That the room felt too quiet. That I felt like an extra piece at a puzzle that had already been completed. He listened. Really listened. No interruptions. No empty affirmations. Just presence. We sat in the same room, a comfortable distance apart, flipping pages of memories that weren't mine. Every once in a while, our hands would meet as we turned a page, and I'd pull mine away just a second too late. It was nothing. Harmless. But inside, something buzzed. Later that afternoon, most of the family left for the local market. I stayed behind, claiming a headache. No one argued. They assumed I needed rest. Maybe I did. He stayed too. I found myself in the kitchen again, rinsing a glass at the sink when he walked in. The room was quiet except for the steady drip from the faucet. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes watching me in a way that made my skin warm beneath my clothes. We talked. About small things at first, the weather, the old furniture, the strange ticking noise in the upstairs bathroom. Then about bigger things. He asked about my work, what I used to love doing before everything became routine. I told him about painting, something I hadn't done in years. He told me about a gallery he'd visited in Paris once, how a single canvas held him still for 10 full minutes. The conversation had weight but no pressure. It flowed, unforced. At some point, I laughed, really laughed, at something he said, and he watched me, his gaze not dropping away. And I felt it. The pull. The gravity of a moment that shifts everything, even if only by a fraction. I tried to step back emotionally. To remind myself of the roles we each played. But something about the quiet intimacy of that empty house, the way our voices filled the spaces left behind by others, made everything feel suspended. That evening, when the family returned, the mood shifted again. Laughter returned, but it didn't touch me the same way. I found myself looking for him across the room, catching his eye for a second too long. He didn't look away. After dinner, there was talk of a walk. Some wanted to stretch their legs before dessert. My husband was still at work. The others bundled up and wandered outside. I stayed back, claiming cold feet. He stayed too. He asked if I wanted to go out for just a minute. The air would do me good, he said. I hesitated, but I went. We walked down the gravel path behind the house, toward the edge of the property where the trees began. The sun had dipped low, casting everything in a muted glow. We didn't speak much. The quiet between us had become its own kind of dialogue. Every step forward felt like moving closer to something neither of us could name. When we stopped, it was by the old swing that hung from a thick branch. I leaned on the rope, fingers curling around the frayed ends. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking at me like he wanted to say something and wasn't sure if he should. I turned toward him. And something in that moment, the hush of twilight, the closeness, the unsaid, drew us together. We kissed. It was brief. Unplanned. And when it ended, we both stepped back like we'd been burned. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, but I shook my head and walked away before either of us could speak. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the wind in the trees. I didn't stop until I was back in the guest room, door shut, hands trembling. I sat on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the floor. What had I done? What had I allowed to begin? And more frighteningly, why did it feel so impossible to regret? The silence of the next morning was heavier than the night had been. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, the covers pulled up to my chin, eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling. It ran across the plaster like a quiet wound, the kind you only noticed when you were still long enough to feel it. My husband still hadn't returned. The bed beside me remained cold and untouched, a physical reminder of his absence, but that absence no longer felt like the problem. It felt like a shadow I had learned to live with. Downstairs, the house stirred with the usual noises of footsteps, the faint clatter of plates, voices speaking too softly for me to make out the words. I wanted to stay in that room, buried under the illusion of routine, but eventually I forced myself to move. I dressed slowly, choosing a sweater that felt safe and soft, as though it might shield me from the weight of my own guilt. My reflection in the mirror was foreign, pale, tense, lips pressed into a line. I barely looked like myself. When I entered the kitchen, his mother greeted me with a cheerful good morning, completely unaware that something had shifted in the night. The others sat at the table, chatting about plans for the day, a visit to the vineyard, maybe, or a drive into the village. I nodded along, offered a few polite smiles, but my body felt detached from the conversation. My mind was elsewhere, stuck in that moment beneath the trees, in the breath we shared and the breath I stole when I walked away. He wasn't at the table. I looked, not obviously, but just enough to notice his absence. I wondered if he was avoiding me or if I was the one avoiding him. Either way, the space between us now felt dense with something unspoken. I volunteered to help with the dishes after breakfast. It gave me a reason to keep my hands busy, to avoid the effort of conversation. As I rinsed a mug under the tap, I caught sight of his reflection in the window. He had entered the room behind me. I stiffened, my shoulders tense, but didn't turn around. He stood there for a beat too long before speaking. "Can I help?" His voice was casual, but the edge to it was unmistakable. I nodded, still not meeting his eyes. He moved to the counter beside me, drying the dishes. I passed him, our hands inches apart. The quiet stretched between us, but this time it wasn't comfortable. It was brittle. Every second felt like it might snap. After the last plate was put away, he set down the towel and leaned against the counter. I knew he wanted to say something. I could feel it rising in the space between us like steam from a kettle. But I couldn't let him. I couldn't risk it. Not now. Not here. "I'm going to take a walk," I said suddenly, too quickly. I didn't wait for a reply. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. I pulled my sleeves over my hands as I followed the familiar path past the garden and down toward the lake at the edge of the property. I needed distance from him, from them, from the version of myself I didn't recognize anymore. The one who had let her guard down. The one who hadn't looked away. At the water's edge, I sat on a stone bench and tried to breathe. Deeply. Evenly. But my thoughts ran too fast. I had kissed him. I had wanted to. And even now, even with guilt twisting inside me, I couldn't pretend it hadn't meant something. But what terrified me more was not what happened, it was how easily it happened. How natural it had felt in the moment. As though my body remembered a version of desire I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. As though I had been waiting for someone, anyone, to see me not as a role, not as a title, but as a woman. That realization sat with me, heavier than anything else. Not the kiss, not the lie it created, but the truth it revealed. That somewhere along the way, I had stopped feeling like a woman. I had become wife, helper, host. Background noise to a life built around someone else's ambitions. And then, someone did see me. By the time I returned to the house, the others had gone. I heard their car pull out of the driveway just as I was walking up the porch steps. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or abandoned. The door creaked softly as I stepped inside. He was in the living room, seated in the armchair with a book in his hands, though I doubted he was reading. He looked up when I entered. Our eyes met for a moment, and in that look was everything we weren't saying. I hesitated, then walked past the doorway without a word, heading toward the guest room. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I moved through it like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, offering smiles that didn't reach my eyes. My husband called in the afternoon. He'd be staying in the city for one more night. Something had come up. I told him to take his time. My voice sounded normal, even to me. He thanked me. Said he missed me. I didn't know what to say to that. In the evening, we all sat around the dining table again. The conversation was light, but I wasn't listening. I watched the way the candlelight flickered across faces. I watched the shadows move. He sat across from me. Our knees almost touched beneath the table. We didn't speak. Later that night, I stood by the window in the hallway, watching the rain tap against the glass. The sky was dark and endless. I pressed my forehead to the cool pane and closed my eyes. I didn't want this. I hadn't planned it. And yet, I had opened a door. One I couldn't close now without consequences. The floor creaked behind me, soft steps moving across the wood. I knew it was him. I didn't turn around. He stopped a few feet away. I could feel the heat of him there, behind me. He didn't speak. Neither did I. Then, slowly, he stepped back. I heard the soft retreat of his footsteps, the gentle click of a door closing down the hall. And I stood there, staring into the night, wondering which of us would shatter the silence first. Or if the silence was the only thing keeping us safe. The rain didn't let up that night. It fell steadily, soft and persistent, tapping against the windows like a whisper I couldn't ignore. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling, counting the seconds between distant rolls of thunder. My husband didn't call again, and I didn't try to reach him. There was nothing to say. Nothing I could say without unraveling everything. By morning, the sky had turned a dull gray, and the air inside the house felt thick. I moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to disturb anyone. I dressed without turning on the lights, brushed my hair with trembling fingers, and made my way downstairs in silence. Most of the family had already gathered in the dining room. The table was half filled with plates of toast, eggs, and fresh fruit, but the mood was subdued. Someone commented on the weather, and someone else joked about needing boats instead of cars. I smiled politely, nodded where appropriate, but every gesture felt rehearsed, like I was acting in a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. He was there. Across the table, eyes on his coffee cup, fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic surface. We didn't speak. We didn't even glance at each other. But the air between us carried the weight of everything we didn't need to say aloud. After breakfast, I disappeared into the laundry room, pretending to look for something to wash. I just needed space. Quiet. A place where no one would look for me. I sat on the closed lid of the washer, hands in my lap, and tried to breathe. The hum of the house muffled behind the door. I felt like I was holding something inside me so fragile that any sudden movement might cause it to break. At some point, I heard footsteps approaching. I braced myself, but it wasn't him. It was his sister, asking if I wanted to join them for a trip into the nearby village. They were planning to browse the shops, maybe have lunch. I said yes. I needed to get out. To be anywhere but here. The car ride was uneventful, filled with idle chatter and a soft radio playing old songs. The village was small but charming, with cobbled streets and storefronts decorated with flowers. I wandered through boutiques and antique shops, touching things I had no intention of buying, just to feel the texture of something real in my hands. At lunch, I sat at the edge of the table, smiling, responding when spoken to, but my thoughts kept drifting. I watched couples walk past the window, holding hands, laughing, lost in their own worlds. I envied them in a way I didn't want to admit. Not for the romance, but for the clarity. The simplicity of knowing where you stood with someone. We returned late in the afternoon. The house was quiet when we arrived. A few of the others had gone for a walk, and the rest were resting in their rooms. I went to the kitchen to make tea. As I poured the hot water into the cup, I felt the presence behind me before I heard him speak. "I thought you might not come back," he said softly. I didn't turn around. I stared at the steam rising from the cup, willing my hands not to shake. "I needed air," I replied, keeping my voice calm, even. He stepped closer, but not too close. There was still space between us. Just enough to keep from drowning in it. "We should talk," he said after a long pause. I finally turned to face him. Our eyes met, and I saw the same conflict mirrored in his regret, confusion, something else that neither of us wanted to name. "There's nothing to say," I answered. But that wasn't true. There was too much to say. More than either of us could handle in that narrow kitchen. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he said. "I know. It's just, you looked like you needed someone to see you." I inhaled sharply, turning back to my tea. That sentence hit harder than anything else could have. Because it was true. I whispered. "But it shouldn't have been you." We stood in silence, the weight of our choices pressing down on the space between us. Then I picked up my cup and walked past him, feeling the heat of his body as I moved by. I didn't look back. The rest of the evening unfolded in slow motion. Dinner was quiet. My husband still hadn't returned. His absence, once background noise, now felt like an echo I couldn't silence. I went through the motions, eating, nodding, smiling, but inside, I was unraveling thread by thread. That night, I couldn't bear to sleep in that room. Instead, I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and went back to the small bench by the lake. The rain had stopped, but the air was cool and damp. I sat there for hours, staring at the dark water, trying to sort through the mess inside me. What had started as a moment, one unexpected kiss, had become something I couldn't unfeel. And yet, I didn't want it to mean anything. I wanted it to vanish. To be undone. But real things don't work like that. You don't get to erase the truth just because it's inconvenient. I heard the creak of wood behind me. I didn't turn. I knew who it was. "You shouldn't be out here," he said gently. "I needed space," I replied. He sat beside me, a careful distance away. We didn't speak for a long time. Finally, I asked, "What do we do now?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. I'm married." "I know. I love him." He didn't respond. And in his silence, I felt the truth settle around us like fog. Eventually, I stood. My legs felt weak, but I kept walking, one step at a time, back toward the house. He didn't follow. And I didn't ask him to. That night, I fell asleep just before dawn, my body exhausted from holding too much. In my dreams, everything was quiet. No rain, no voices, no decisions. Just quiet. I woke to the sound of a suitcase being zipped. At first, I thought I had imagined it, one of those strange fragments that slip into the edges of sleep, but when I opened my eyes, the morning light was already soft and golden through the window, and the sound was unmistakably real. I pushed myself up slowly, heart thudding for no clear reason, and padded across the floor in bare feet. When I opened the door, I saw him standing in the hallway, halfway into his coat, a small bag at his feet. My husband. He was finally home. He looked up when he saw me and gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. His face looked tired, older somehow, as if he'd lived a month in the few days he'd been away. "I didn't want to wake you," he said quietly. "I got back late." I nodded, unsure of what to say. My throat felt tight, and there was a strange distance in the air between us, like time had stretched too far and couldn't quite snap back. He explained that another emergency had come up, that he was being pulled into another case, another shift. I listened, watching the way his hands moved, calm, controlled, always efficient. There was no trace of anger, no suspicion. He spoke to me like everything was still intact. I wanted to reach out and touch him. Not in a romantic way, but to see if he would flinch. If he could feel what I was carrying beneath my skin. But I didn't move. I just stood there, nodding in the right places, pretending that the version of me he believed in still existed. When he kissed my cheek goodbye, his lips were cool. I closed my eyes for a second too long. Then he was gone again, and I was left with the faint scent of his cologne and the quiet click of the door. I spent most of the day wandering. Through the garden, then the woods, then the old barn at the edge of the property. Each place felt like an echo chamber, filled with memories that didn't belong to me. The others were busy baking, preparing decorations, organizing an early birthday celebration for someone. I wasn't needed, and I didn't offer. I couldn't bring myself to play a part in something that felt so distant from the storm inside me. In the late afternoon, I found myself back in the living room, staring at a shelf of old books. Dusty, yellowed with age, their spines cracked and familiar. I pulled one down at random and sank into the armchair, letting the pages fall open. But I didn't read. I just stared at the words until they blurred. He entered quietly. I didn't look up, but I knew it was him. His presence had become something I could feel before I could see. He didn't speak at first. He sat in the other chair across from me, elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely intertwined. We stayed like that for several minutes, silent, unmoving. Then, in the calmest voice possible, he said, "I wasn't sure if you'd talk to me again." I closed the book slowly and placed it on my lap. My hands were trembling, but I didn't try to stop them. "This wasn't supposed to happen," I said, and my voice barely made it across the room. "I know," he replied. "But it did." I looked at him then, really looked. There was no smugness in his expression, no arrogance or bravado. Just sorrow. Quiet and raw. It matched mine in a way that terrified me. "I'm not who you think I am," I said. "You're more than what you've been allowed to be," he answered. That sentence landed hard, pressing into all the parts of me I had tried to silence. I didn't want to cry, but the tears came anyway, not in sobs, just a slow, steady release like rain dripping from a roof. "I feel like I don't know myself anymore," I whispered. "And I don't know how to go back." "Maybe you're not supposed to," he said. I stood abruptly, needing to move, to escape the weight of the room. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the way the last light of day slipped through the trees. Behind me, I heard him rise. I didn't turn. "You're not alone in this," he said softly. "But I am," I answered. "Because when this ends, you'll go back to your life, and I'll go back to pretending mine still fits." He took a step forward. I felt it. The air shifted. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "Not forever. Just for a drive. Just to breathe." I turned to look at him, startled. "Now?" He nodded. "Now." I don't know why I agreed. Maybe because I was tired of sitting still. Maybe because some part of me wanted to feel like I still had a choice. I slipped on my coat and followed him out the door. We didn't speak in the car. The road stretched out ahead of us, empty and quiet. We drove past fields and trees and tiny houses with dim porch lights. After a while, he pulled off onto a gravel path that led to an overlook I'd never seen before. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched wide beneath us, the lights of the village twinkling like scattered stars. I stepped out and walked to the edge, hugging my coat tighter around me. He joined me, standing just far enough away to be respectful. "This is where I come when I need to think," he said. "It's beautiful," I replied. "It's honest," he said. "That's what I like about it. It doesn't try to be more than it is." We stood there for a long time. The wind picked up, brushing hair across my face, and I didn't bother fixing it. I just closed my eyes and breathed. And then, without warning, everything inside me gave way. The months, the years, the silence, the aching for something I couldn't name, it all flooded through me at once. I turned to him. We kissed. It was soft, unhurried, not searching for answers but acknowledging the truth that had been waiting between us. And when it ended, we didn't speak. We didn't have to. We returned to the car, and the drive back was silent once again. But it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said and everything we couldn't undo. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Everyone was asleep. I stepped out of the car, turned toward him, and offered the smallest nod. Then I went inside. Alone. The following morning was unusually quiet. Not the gentle quiet of a peaceful household, but the thick, unsettled kind that settled into the corners of a room like unspoken tension. I woke before the others, startled by the sunlight streaming across the floorboards. My body ached in unfamiliar ways, not from exertion, but from holding in too much. Thoughts, guilt, longing, they lived in every joint, every breath, every pause. I got dressed slowly, deliberately choosing clothes that made me feel neutral. No colors, no softness, nothing that hinted at emotion. Just fabric to cover skin. Armor, in a sense. When I went downstairs, I found his mother humming in the kitchen. She didn't ask where I had been the night before, nor did she comment on the early hour. Instead, she handed me a cup of coffee and patted my hand with a smile. I felt a lump rise in my throat, not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. No one noticed. No one questioned. And maybe that was worse. As the others trickled in, conversation resumed around me. There was talk of going to the orchard later, of picking apples before the season ended. I nodded, offering small smiles when necessary, pretending to exist fully in their world. But inside, I was unraveling. Every moment I spent in silence was a battle against the rising panic that I might never find my footing again. He wasn't around. I didn't know where he had gone, but the absence was noticeable. Not just to me, others asked about him casually, wondering if he'd taken a walk or gone into town. I said I didn't know. And that was the truth. We left for the orchard in 2 cars, the air crisp, the road winding gently through early autumn trees. The smell of fallen leaves mixed with distant wood smoke filled the car, but I couldn't focus on the scenery. My mind drifted, not just to the night before, but to the accumulation of everything that had led me here. For years, I'd built a life around someone else's rhythm. My husband's schedule, his career, his family's expectations. I had learned how to be dependable, how to be agreeable, how to fill in the silences without ever drawing attention. But I hadn't learned how to be myself. Somewhere along the way, I had mistaken invisibility for loyalty. The orchard was beautiful. Rows of trees heavy with fruit, their branches dipping low with the weight of the season. Children ran between them with baskets, laughter echoing through the cool air. I tried to lose myself in the task, reaching for apples, feeling the roughness of bark under my fingers. But nothing felt real. My body moved, but I wasn't inside it. At some point, I wandered off. Just far enough to be out of sight. I needed space, solitude. I stood beneath a tree, fingers curled around its trunk, and let my head fall back. The sky above was the color of ash, and the breeze whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. Footsteps approached. I didn't move. "You disappeared," he said quietly. "I needed air," I replied, still not turning around. There was a long pause. "I should go," he said. "I've been thinking about it all morning." I finally turned to face him. His eyes were tired, guarded. He looked like he had slept even less than I had. "Maybe that's for the best," I said. He nodded slowly. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I wasn't looking for it." "I know," I whispered. "Neither was I." We stood there, the weight of those words pressing between us like an invisible wall. And then he said something that pierced straight through me. "But I don't regret it." I couldn't answer. My throat closed up, and all I could do was look away. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to push him away, to say that none of this should have happened. But the truth was, I didn't regret it either. I regretted the consequences, the impossibility, the betrayal. But not the moment itself. Because in that moment, I had felt something I hadn't in years seen. We returned separately. I joined the others near the edge of the orchard, where a makeshift picnic was being set up. Blankets, thermoses, paper plates. My husband had called again, apparently, leaving a voicemail that he'd try to come back by the weekend. I nodded when they told me, but I didn't say anything else. Back at the house, the rest of the day passed in shallow waves, small talk, board games, cups of tea. I moved through it all on autopilot, offering enough of myself to remain unnoticed. No one asked where I had gone earlier. No one asked why my smile never quite reached my eyes. That evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself alone on the back porch. The wood beneath me creaked slightly as I rocked in the chair, my hands wrapped around a mug of something warm. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just feeling, the dull ache of confusion, the persistent hum of guilt, the sharp edge of yearning. He stepped outside after some time, stopping when he saw me. "I won't stay long," he said. I didn't answer. I just wanted to say goodbye. I looked up. His face was calm, but the sadness was unmistakable. "Are you leaving tonight?" I asked. He nodded. "Early morning." There was a pause. "I think that's wise," I said. He stepped down onto the grass, hesitating near the edge of the porch. The last light of day lit the side of his face, making him look older, more human. Less like a mistake and more like someone who had simply stumbled in the same direction I had. "If things were different," he began, then stopped. I finished it for him in my head. If things were different, maybe we wouldn't be here, standing on opposite sides of a moment that changed everything. "Safe drive," I said. He nodded once and turned away. I watched him go. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just watched, my fingers tightening slightly around the mug as if it were the only thing anchoring me. Later that night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay awake, listening to the distant ticking of the old grandfather clock down the hall. I stared at the ceiling, retracing the choices that had brought me here. And for the first time, I realized I couldn't undo them. Not with time. Not with silence. Not with distance. They were part of me now. Woven into the fabric of who I had become. And no matter how hard I tried to go back, the truth was, I no longer knew who I was going back to. The house was still when I came downstairs the next morning. I paused halfway down the steps, expecting to hear the usual clatter of dishes or muffled voices from the kitchen, but there was only quiet. A kind of hush that felt both peaceful and unnerving. I walked slowly through the hallway, glancing into rooms that were now empty. His room, I noticed, had been cleared. The suitcase was gone. The bed neatly made. A clean absence, almost surgical. The knowledge that he had truly left settled in my chest with surprising weight. It wasn't longing that gripped me, nor heartbreak, just a quiet awareness that something had shifted, finally and irreversibly. A door had been closed. Not slammed, not locked, just gently, firmly shut. Outside, the fog hung low over the yard. The trees were still, as if holding their breath. I stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders. The cold bit at my skin, but I welcomed it. It helped me feel something, anything, after the numbness that had blanketed me overnight. My husband was expected back that evening. That thought repeated in my mind like a metronome. I didn't know what I would say to him, or what version of myself would greet him at the door. Would I pretend everything was fine? Would I confess? Would I ask for something I hadn't yet defined? The hours crept by. I occupied myself with small tasks, folding towels that didn't need folding, rearranging books on a shelf, wiping already clean surfaces. I needed control. I needed stillness. But even with my hands busy, my thoughts wouldn't stop racing. In the afternoon, I walked down to the small lake behind the property. The air smelled like earth and water, a mix that always reminded me of endings. I sat on the dock, legs crossed beneath me, watching a single leaf drift across the surface. Time stretched. The quiet wrapped around me. For a brief moment, I wished I could disappear into it completely. He returned just before dusk. I heard the sound of gravel shifting beneath tires, then the slam of the car door. I stood in the hallway, frozen, as he entered through the side door, shaking off the cold and unzipping his coat. When he saw me, he gave a tired smile. "You're here," he said. "I am." He dropped his keys into the bowl by the door and set his bag down. There was something in his posture, not defeat exactly, but weariness. As if he too had been holding things in that had grown too heavy to carry. We didn't speak much at dinner. The family buzzed around us, unaware of the silent threads tightening between us. He answered questions, offered stories from work, asked his mother about her back. He reached for my hand under the table once, briefly, a gesture of familiarity. I let him. After the meal, we excused ourselves and retreated to the guest room. He began unpacking, humming softly under his breath. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap, feeling like a guest in my own skin. "Everything okay?" he asked eventually, glancing over his shoulder. I nodded. Then paused. Then shook my head. He turned fully to face me, concern furrowing his brow. "I don't know what's wrong," I said softly. "I just know something is." He walked over and sat beside me. We were close, but not touching. The space between us was filled with a history of unsaid things. "We've been off, haven't we?" he said. "Yes," I replied. He sighed. "I think I didn't want to see it." I looked at him then, really looked, at the fine lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the hands that had held so many lives together with steadiness and strength. I used to find comfort in that steadiness. Now it felt like distance. "I don't blame you," I said. "I didn't want to see it either." He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Is there someone else?" The question didn't come with anger. Just a deep sadness, like he already knew the answer but hoped he was wrong. I couldn't lie. Not anymore. I nodded, barely. He didn't speak again right away. Just inhaled deeply and looked down at the floor. "Did you love him?" he asked. "No," I said honestly. But for a moment. I remembered what it felt like to be seen. He closed his eyes, and I could see the pain settle across his face. Not rage. Not betrayal. Just sorrow. "I thought I was giving you everything," he whispered. "I know." We sat there in silence, the weight of years pressing against us. And then he reached for my hand again. This time, I let him hold it. "I don't know what this means for us," he said. "But I'm not ready to give up." "Are you?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to fall into that comfort, to pretend that what we had could simply be rewound, reset. But the truth was more complicated. "I don't know," I admitted. And for the first time in a long time, he nodded as if he truly understood. That night, we didn't talk anymore. We undressed quietly, changed into pajamas, and slipped into bed. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady beside me. I lay awake, eyes tracing the ceiling, mind swirling. He had come back. And so had I. But neither of us had returned to the same place we'd left. And as I lay there in the dark, I understood that sometimes coming back doesn't mean beginning again. Sometimes, it means facing what's left, and deciding whether to rebuild or walk away. The following days passed in a blur of carefully curated normalcy. He stayed close, more present than he had been in months, maybe years. He helped set the table, asked questions during family meals, offered to drive his mother to town when no one else volunteered. He reached for my hand more often now, and when he smiled, it was softer, more searching. I think he was trying to rebuild something he wasn't sure had crumbled. And I let him. I let him because part of me wanted to believe it was possible. That we could patch over the silence with kindness, that we could cover the fissures with routine, that we could pretend our love hadn't slowly dimmed under the weight of our own blind spots. But the truth didn't go away just because we stopped speaking it. I woke each morning with the same tightness in my chest, the same awareness that what had been done couldn't be undone. I couldn't erase that kiss. I couldn't erase the moment we drove out to that overlook. And I couldn't forget the way I'd felt when I turned the key to go back inside alone. More than anything, I couldn't forget how easy it had been to let it happen. It rained the day we were supposed to leave. Not heavily, just a fine, persistent drizzle that turned the gravel path into mud and made the windows fog over. The house was buzzing with activity, packing bags, folding blankets, returning borrowed sweaters to closets. His sister baked muffins for the road. His cousin left early to catch a flight. The entire place felt like it was deflating, the warmth of the gathering dissolving into polite goodbyes and checklists. I lingered. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I didn't know where I belonged anymore. The home I was returning to would be the same in structure, but everything inside me had shifted. I knew what waited there, our kitchen, our coffee mugs, our carefully choreographed days. And I no longer knew how to live inside them. He came up behind me while I stood in the hallway, staring out the rain-covered window. His reflection appeared beside mine in the glass. "Almost ready?" he asked. I nodded, still looking outside. "We could stay another day if you wanted," he added. "No," I said. "It's time." He didn't press. The drive back was quiet. We took the longer route, one that curved through small towns and long stretches of road lined with sleeping fields. He kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other occasionally tapping against his knee. I watched the landscape shift, my thoughts caught somewhere between memory and dread. At one point, he turned the radio on. A song played, something familiar and melancholy, and we both let it fill the silence. Neither of us spoke. It was better that way. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the house looked exactly as we had left it. Not a single thing out of place. I stepped inside and felt the weight of familiarity wrap around me like a blanket I didn't want to wear. Everything was exactly the same, and I was not. We unpacked in silence. I put away laundry. He restocked the fridge. We moved in parallel, orbiting each other with careful distance, neither pushing nor retreating. By evening, we were sitting on opposite sides of the living room, each with a book in hand, pretending to read. Eventually, he broke the silence. "I'm glad we went," he said. I looked up from the page I hadn't actually been reading. "Are you?" He nodded. "It reminded me of what we've built. Even if we've let parts of it slip." I stared at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then I set the book down and folded my hands in my lap. "I need to tell you something," I said. His posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough that I saw the shift. He placed his book face down on the arm of the chair and leaned forward slightly. "Okay." I didn't know where to begin. I'd rehearsed the words in my mind so many times, but none of them fit now. Not in this space. Not with his face open and waiting. "I made a mistake," I began. "While we were at your family's house." His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't go looking for it. But something shifted in me. And I crossed a line. I couldn't bring myself to say it outright. The specifics felt too raw. Too sharp." His voice was quiet. "Did you sleep with him?" I shook my head. "No. But I kissed him. And I went with him somewhere I shouldn't have." He looked away then, eyes fixed on the floor. I watched the silence fill his body, watched it settle in his shoulders, his jaw, his hands. "Was it about him?" he asked after a long pause. "Or about me?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe both. Maybe neither. I just know that something inside me has been missing for a long time, and I didn't even realize it until someone saw it." He nodded slowly, as if he'd already known. "I always thought we were fine," he said. "Not perfect. But solid." "We were," I replied. "In the way a house can be solid and still feel empty." He closed his eyes, pressing his fingers to his temple. "I wish you had told me." "I didn't know how," I said. "I didn't even know what I needed until I broke something to find it." The room was heavy with everything we weren't saying. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted. "Neither do I," I said. "But I don't want to lie anymore." He stayed there for a while, unmoving. I waited, unsure whether he would leave, yell, cry, or say nothing at all. Eventually, he turned back toward me. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight," he said. I nodded. "Okay." He walked past me without another word, and I listened as his footsteps faded down the hall. Then the door closed gently, and I was alone in the quiet of our home. I sat there long after the lights were off, the room dark around me. I stared at the place where he had sat, where we had shared laughter, silence, love. And then I lowered my head into my hands and let the stillness finally break. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain again. It seemed fitting, like the weather had taken on the weight of what now lived between us. I sat up slowly, the sheets tangled around my legs, and stared at the empty side of the bed. I hadn't slept much. My mind had turned in endless circles, reliving the conversation from the night before, examining every word, every pause, as if understanding it might somehow change the outcome. The house was unusually still. The kind of stillness that follows a storm, when the air feels fragile and no one dares to speak too loudly. I padded across the floor barefoot, wrapped a sweater around myself, and walked quietly into the hallway. The guest room door was closed. In the kitchen, the coffee pot was half full. He had already been up. That detail struck me more than it should have. I poured a cup and sat at the table, the ceramic warm between my palms. Everything around me looked exactly the same, our chairs, the dishes, the stack of unopened mail, but it all felt different, as though the room itself had shifted in its bones. When he entered the room, I didn't look up right away. I heard him pause, probably gauging the temperature of the space before moving toward the counter. He poured himself a cup, and then sat across from me. We didn't speak at first. The silence wasn't hostile, it was cautious. Like we were two people standing on cracked ice, testing the weight of every movement. He was the one who broke it. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low but even. I lifted my eyes. He looked exhausted but composed. Not angry. Not cold. Just tired. "I think we should take some time apart." The words didn't surprise me. Not really. But hearing them out loud still landed like a stone. "Okay," I said after a moment. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't even sadness. Just acceptance. "I don't mean a final decision," he continued. I need space to figure out what this means. For us. For me." I nodded. I understood. Because I needed the same thing. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. I'll go. I can stay with my brother for a while." I looked down at my coffee, the steam now fading. "How long?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "A week. 2. Maybe more. I'm not trying to punish you. I just don't think I can be here right now." I wanted to say something, to offer comfort or reassurance, but nothing felt appropriate. Everything had already been said. The truth was now a part of us. It didn't need repeating. He packed quietly. Just a small bag. Essentials. The rest he left untouched, as though acknowledging that this might still be temporary. I watched him move around the house with the same calm he'd always carried, but this time there was a heaviness to his movements. A slowness that came from carrying more than just physical weight. When he left, he didn't hug me. We stood at the door like two people at the end of a long visit. "I'll call you in a few days," he said. "Okay." Then he walked to his car, started the engine, and pulled away. I stood there long after the taillights disappeared, the echo of his departure still humming in the driveway. The house was too quiet after that. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that makes you feel like a guest in your own life. I wandered through the rooms, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, as if the act might reconnect me to something. Later, I sat in the living room and looked through old photo albums. There were pictures from when we first met, smiling, sunlit, young. Trips to places we never visited again. Holiday dinners. Random moments that, at the time, felt like nothing special, but now glowed with the strange nostalgia of a life once fully inhabited. I studied my own face in those pictures. The way my eyes looked then. The way I leaned into him without thinking. That woman felt like a stranger now. A memory of someone I had once known and loved, but could no longer fully access. I stayed inside the rest of the day, moving slowly, cleaning more than necessary. Not because things were dirty, but because I needed something to do with my hands. In the afternoon, I found the sweater he had left draped over the back of the chair. I held it for a long time before folding it carefully and placing it in the closet. That night, I cooked dinner for one. Something simple. I sat only one place at the table, ate in silence, and let the clinking of the fork on the plate fill the air. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. But I felt hollow in a way I couldn't quite explain. Afterward, I sat outside on the back steps with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The sky was cloudy, the stars hidden. The chill in the air sank deep into my bones, but I didn't move. I just sat there, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, the wind, the occasional passing car, a distant dog barking. In that stillness, I thought about what I had done. Not just the kiss. Not just the lies. But all the tiny betrayals that had come before it. The ways I had slowly withdrawn, the conversations I hadn't started, the needs I hadn't voiced. I had spent years playing a part, then resented him for not seeing who I really was. But I had hidden myself. I had been complicit in my own disappearance. And when someone had finally looked at me and seen what was buried, I had reached for it without thinking. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone. But because I had forgotten how it felt to be noticed without asking. Now, all that remained was consequence. Space. Silence. And the long, slow work of figuring out what came next. A week passed. Then two. The days bled into one another with quiet repetition. Morning light, coffee, silence. The emptiness of the house began to feel normal, not like a punishment but more like a question I had yet to answer. I kept myself occupied with small routines, folding laundry, tending to the garden, rearranging books I wasn't reading. It gave the illusion of stability, even if nothing inside me felt still. I didn't hear from him right away. I told myself it was good, that we both needed space. That silence was healing. But every time the phone buzzed and it wasn't him, something in my chest pulled tight. I stopped expecting apologies. I didn't need them. I just needed to know he hadn't disappeared emotionally the way he had physically. Eventually, he texted. Just a single line, "How are you?" I stared at the words for a long time, then set the phone down without responding. I wasn't angry. I just didn't know how to condense everything I was feeling into something brief enough to fit on a screen. How do you answer a question like that when you're not even sure who you are anymore? I spent more time outdoors. There was something about the rhythm of nature that soothed me. The trees didn't ask questions. The sky didn't judge. I'd walk for hours, sometimes in circles, just to remind myself that I was still capable of movement. That I hadn't become entirely frozen in the aftermath of my own mistakes. One afternoon, I found an old box tucked in the corner of the garage. It was filled with photos, letters, little remnants of our life together. Ticket stubs from concerts we barely remembered, postcards from cities we passed through without really seeing. I sat on the floor for over an hour, sifting through memories that felt faded, like clothes left too long in the sun. There was a picture of us from the early days, sitting on the steps of our first apartment, laughing at something forgotten. I stared at it for a long time. We looked so young, not just in years but in spirit. Back then, the future had felt expansive, wide open. We had no map, only the shared belief that we would figure it out together. Somewhere along the way, that belief had fractured. I wanted to go back and ask that version of myself, what will you do when love becomes quiet? When it stops looking like fireworks and starts resembling routine? When your heart is still, not because it is full, but because it's tired? But I already knew the answer. I'd been living it. Days later, he called. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was careful, as if testing the temperature of the air between us. Hi. Hi. I didn't want to push, he said. I just wanted to check in. I know, I said. I've been thinking too. There was a pause. I miss you, he said. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me missed him too, but it wasn't just him I longed for. It was the idea of us. Who we were before we stopped noticing each other. Before everything became functional. I don't know what we are anymore, I admitted. I don't either, he said. We didn't argue. We didn't try to name the ache. We just sat with it. He asked if I'd be open to meeting in person. Not to make decisions, but to talk. To listen. To try. I said yes. We met 2 days later at a small cafe on the edge of town. Neutral ground. It was quiet, almost empty. The kind of place where no one looked twice. He was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, fingers wrapped around a mug. He looked up when I entered, and for a second, we both hesitated, like two people seeing each other for the first time after a long absence. I sat down across from him. He didn't reach for my hand. I didn't expect him to. He asked how I'd been. I told him the truth, some days were okay, most were not. I told him I'd been thinking about who I'd become, and whether I had ever truly let him know that person. He nodded, listening without interruption. He said he had been asking himself similar questions, about how often he had taken things for granted, how easily he'd assumed that silence meant everything was fine. We talked for nearly 2 hours. No blame. No lists. Just slow, painful honesty. It wasn't about fixing things. It was about laying everything on the table, finally, without fear. At the end, he said, I don't know if we'll find our way back. But I'd like to try. I looked at him carefully. There was vulnerability in his eyes, and also something steadier, resolve, perhaps. Or hope. I don't know either, I said. But I don't want to keep pretending that nothing happened. He agreed. We'll take it slow. No pressure. We walked to the parking lot in silence. When we reached his car, he turned to me. I'm not ready to move back in, he said. Not yet. But maybe we can start seeing each other. Not as husband and wife. Just as people. I nodded. That felt like the right place to begin. That night, I returned home to the same house. But it didn't feel the same anymore. The silence wasn't as sharp. The loneliness didn't cut as deep. I lit a candle, made tea, and sat in the living room, letting the warmth fill the space. I knew the road ahead would be long. Rebuilding something, or choosing to walk away from it entirely, required more than just intention. It required effort, patience, grace. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lost. I felt like a woman who had seen herself clearly. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of everything.